Hey team, we're going to learn how to build a CRUD API to manage products in an online store, including spinning up a new application where we can actually manage our products, and using Next.js serverless functions to trigger HarperDB Custom Functions to add and manage our data in our database. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. This video is brought to you and sponsored by HarperDB. HarperDB is an app platform that allows you to work with data globally. It goes beyond a simple database, including custom functions, which we'll use today, to make it easy to work with data in your application workflow. Head over to spacejelly.dev/HarperDB and get started with your free instance today. So digging in, the core of what we're going to do is use custom functions in order to build our CRUD API. If you're not familiar with CRUD, CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. Where create, we're basically going to add something new. Read, we're going to read those existing items. Update, we're going to take those items and update some kind of feature about them. And then finally delete is where we're going to actually remove that item. But back to custom functions, this gives us a lot of flexibility where we can make queries to Harper directly from those custom functions. The tricky part though is we want to make sure that not just anybody can make a request to these custom functions. We want to make sure that we can do so authenticated. And to do so, we don't want to be able to run those custom functions in the client. So what we're going to do, use Next.js to basically create a secure proxy for those requests, where what we're going to do is provide our API key and invoke that custom function from our Next.js function. So to get started, we're going to use this product dashboard starter that I created. And if you want to follow along, you can find this link directly in the description of this video. But I'm going to go ahead and copy this yarn create next app line, or you can use npx and npm if you prefer. And then I'm going to paste that right inside my terminal, where I'm going to also add my dashboard, where what this is going to do is clone down this starter that I created to your local directory. It's going to install all the dependencies, and it's even going to reset the Git history for you. Now, once it's finished, we can see that we can navigate into my dashboard, and I can run yarn dev, which is going to spin up a local development server where if I open it up in my browser, we can see our brand new application that has some of our products already filled in for us. Now, this starter comes with a lot of stuff out of the box, as we're not going to focus on the UI for this tutorial. We're going to focus on the API. So we can see that we have an add product page. We can even see that we have an update product page, as well as a delete product page. But all these are going to use our endpoints in order to manage this product data. Looking inside of the code, we can see that it's a pretty standard React Next.js application. We're going to go to the pages where we see that we have our home page, and what it's currently doing is using use SWR in order to fetch those products with a stubbed API, which we'll see in a second here. But all this is doing is making it easy for us to fetch all those products and dump them into our page, which we're rendering out all that product data from within React. Now, as I mentioned, I have this stubbed out all products API where literally all it's doing is returning static data right now. And we're going to replace this, but this is just so we can get started and we can have an idea where we can follow along. As far as the other pages are concerned, we can see that we have some forms and event handlers, where this one, for instance, the add page, what this is going to do is anytime somebody clicks the on add submit, it's going to grab all that product data from that form so that we can then set up that handler to fire and trigger the API call to actually add that product. And the similar thing will happen in the delete and the update pages. So let's just do that and get started, where we're going to first stub out all of our CRUD API routes for this application. So under the API directory, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call that products, where inside of products, we're going to create 4 new routes, including add.js, delete.js, list.js, and update.js. Now you might notice that I used add and list for the names of this, and it's usually common not to actually name things create and read, as those aren't as human as terms, I guess, where I'm going to call my route add, which is going to actually perform the create, and list, which is actually going to perform the read. Now inside all of those, I'm going to paste in pretty much the same boilerplate, where we have our default async function handler, which is going to take a request and a response as our arguments, but ultimately it's going to fire a status of 200 and return a JSON object, which will eventually add something to it, but for now we'll just have an empty object. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to paste it into all my other routes, where then finally I'm going to actually go back to add.js and I'm going to change it from a 200 to a 201. HTTP codes are a way to tell the browser, the developer, and everything in that lifecycle what's actually happening. And we're using in the 200 range, which means it was successful. And if we start to look at this, 200 okay means basically everything worked as expected. But with some of our actions, we have the ability to be a little bit more granular, particularly our 201, which gives us the ability to say something was created, which is exactly what's going to happen when we add something. Now for delete, list, and update, there really aren't granular ways for us to handle that just for the happy path, so we're going to leave those as 200 and only change add to 201. But now we can see that these are working by going to these API routes inside of our browser, by going into API products add, which we see that response of just an empty object, but we can see that it's definitely working no matter which one of these we're going to. So now let's actually get all this working properly. Starting in our homepage or index.js, we essentially want to just replace the endpoint that's fetching all those products. And currently we don't have a database, we don't have any data in a database, so we're not going to see anything. It's going to actually break everything, but let's just prepare for when we do have that data and replace all products to products or API/products/list. But as expected, all of our products vanish from our homepage, but we'll add all those back in when we actually finish building out our API. Next, we have the add page, where whenever somebody actually submits the add form, we want to take that product data and post it to our add.js route. So I'm going to say I want to await a fetch, where I'm going to make a fetch to /API/products/add, where I'm going to pass in a second parameter where I'm going to specify my method as post, and then I'm going to specify my body where I'm going to run JSON.stringify, and I'm going to pass in that product data. Now, after I have that product data and that fetch request, I want to transform it to JSON for something I can read and work with. So I'm going to chain a then at the end of that, and I'm going to say I want to take that response, and I'm just going to run R to JSON, which is going to transform it to JSON when it returns back to me. Now, ultimately, after this fetch request is successful and it posts that product data, I don't want to just stay on that add page. I want to go back to the home page. So I'm going to first store those results in a results constant, where I'm going to use the included Next.js router to say if I have results and I have data in those results and my data has an ID, I'm going to use router.push, and I'm going to specify a slash, which is basically saying that I want to navigate to the home page. Now this results.data.id, I know ahead of time that that's what my data is going to look like. So you can always loop back around after you test this out so you can figure out where you need to check your data that it worked. But ultimately it's going to be results.data.id, and I'm using optional chaining to make sure that it's actually going to work rather than pushing somebody to the home page if it fails. So next up, we have the delete page, where we're going to do something pretty similar. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my add page, and I'm just going to first copy that and paste it into this handle on delete function, which is going to run anytime somebody clicks the button for actually deleting. Now the difference, we're going to update that endpoint to delete, and in this particular application, the way that it's going to work is whenever somebody navigates to this delete page from the home page, we're going to pass in a query parameter of ID. So we're going to specify that ID and say we want to delete it by the ID, which is going to be ID as the body that we're going to pass into this request, which we're going to get from router.query.id. Now finally, again, I know what this data looks like ahead of time, and it's not going to be this simple this time. But I'm going to paste this in where I'm going to say I want to check if my deleted hashes from my results of my results includes that ID to validate that we did indeed delete that item. Now again, you're going to be able to see this later when you actually be able to log out the results of that API request, which we can't really do right now. So if you're not following along, you can check that out by logging out the results. But this is what the data is going to look like if you're following along with my application. And just a quick note, if you want to see what this code looks like in practice, check out the link in the description where I have the full source for this application that you can check out on your own. But finally, we're going to move on to the update.js page, where it's going to look very similar to both the other pages. So I'm going to go ahead and copy from my add page and paste it right below inside of the handle on update, where we're going to do the same thing, except this time we're going to hit the update endpoint, and we're going to change how we actually pass in this product, where we're going to pass in an object and still spread out our product data to make sure we are passing that all in properly. But similar to what we did on delete, we're going to pass in that ID using router.query.id just to make sure that we have that identifier based off of what we're using inside of that router value when navigating to that page to update. Now, similar to the other two, I know the data ahead of time, but I'm going to paste in what that's going to look like, where instead of deleted hashes, this time we're going to get update hashes, where we're going to check to make sure that ID is included in the hashes that were updated from that request. But at this point, this is all we had to do to update our current application in order to interface with the API. And just as a reminder, this is only if you're following along with this specific application that I built, so that we can make sure that we can focus on the actual data APIs as opposed to trying to work with the actual application UI. So now let's actually build out these endpoints. And to do that, we need to head over to HarperDB, where if you don't have an account, you can sign up for free. Where once you're logged in, the first thing you want to do is create your new HarperDB cloud instance, which you can do completely for free. But once you have that ready, which I already have my instance ready, you can navigate into that instance, and we can see the UI is loaded with a pretty much blank slate, where here we want to be able to start creating our data structures, where we have two concepts, where we have schemas and tables, and pretty much schemas are going to represent groups of tables. So because everything that I'm building kind of centers around products, I'm going to call my schema products. I'm going to hit the green check mark. And then inside of my tables, I want to create a table that represents all of my product data. Now, in e-commerce stores, if you have a bunch of products, you have SKUs that are associated with each individual product. Now, if you have a t-shirt, for instance, with a bunch of different colors, each of those t-shirt colors are going to have their own SKUs. So let's name this table SKUs so that we can more appropriately set ourselves up for success with our store. And then for our hash attribute, this is going to be a unique value for every single item. And while technically we could probably use a product ID, we want to try to keep that separate to make sure there's no conflicts ever. So I'm going to just simply use ID, which will be independent from our actual SKU or product ID. So then I'm going to click check. And we can see once that's made, I now have my new table, which is under products SKUs, but I currently have no records, which makes sense because I just created that new table. Now, as far as the table is concerned, there's nothing else we really need to do except interact with our table. So we're going to navigate over to the Functions tab, where if this is your first time visiting Functions, you may need to click Enable in order to enable custom functions on your database instance. But once you do have it enabled, we can now create a new project. We're similar to when we created our schema, we're still working with products. So I'm going to name my project Products, and I'm going to click the green check mark. Now, once that loads, Harper is going to scaffold a new project, including some example routes that you can play around with and some helpers that you can use in order to get productive with working with custom functions. But we're not going to use any of that for our project. What we're going to first do is create a new route. So I'm going to click the plus next to routes, and let's call this SKUs, as we're going to ultimately interact with our SKUs. Now again, Harper is going to scaffold some code for us, and we can actually get rid of all this code as we're not going to use it. Particularly, let's get rid of needle and filter, as we're not going to use either of those modules, and let's get rid of all the existing routes in there because we're going to add them in ourselves. Now, as you can imagine, it'll take a lot of time to try to write all these out on this video, so I'm going to first write out the initial list endpoint, which is going to read all of our product data, and then I'm going to paste in and review the code for all the rest of the routes. So when defining our routes, we're going to run server.route, and we can see that we get some completion there, but inside I'm going to pass in a new object where we're going to pass in a few properties, including URL, which we're going to specify as /SKUs/list. And if we notice, we're passing SKUs, which is going to be the same route as our actual route. But what we want to do is make sure that those are aligned so that we can kind of have a good organizational way of keeping tracks of these things. So when we actually hit the endpoint, it's going to be /products/SKUs/list. So that gives us a little bit of an organizational structure. But then I want to specify my method, and I'm going to make it a GET request since I'm going to read my data. And then I have three other properties that I need to define that are specific to how we're going to deal with our custom functions, including pre-parsing, pre-validation, and a handler. Now, the way that these are going to work is pre-parsing is going to run where we're going to be able to modify the body of this API route in order to add the query that we want to run. As far as the other two are concerned, pre-validation is going to run its own validation method, which we're going to just pass right in as is. And similarly with handler, that's going to allow us to do something after the request where we're going to pass that in as well, where all we're going to do for this one is get our items and return them. So starting with pre-parsing, we're going to define a new function where inside we're going to get a request, a response, and as well as a function of done. Inside here, we're going to update the request body to include our query. So we're going to say request.body, and we're going to set that equal to a new object where we want to run an operation of SQL, where then I'm going to specify my SQL property, and I'm going to say I want that to be select all from my product.skus table. And then after that's done, I'm going to run the done function, basically telling Harper that I'm done with that operation. But then we want to update our pre-validation and our handler, where we're going to use the HDB core and specify the pre-validation, which we can see that's auto-completing, which we're going to pass in right as is. And then we're going to pass in the HDB core, and we're going to pass in the request. Now at this point, we have our get request to list all of our SKUs. And again, we don't have any SKUs currently, but we can save this and get this running to test out that it's working by clicking the save button. And then I'm going to click the deploy button up at the top here, where in the background, HarperDB is going to now restart the server and deploy those new functions. Now that's going to take a few seconds to load, but you can navigate back to the functions section where under SKUs, we can see that we still have our code. Now, technically, we're not going to be able to see this work yet until we actually use our API token, but if we scroll down, we can find this custom server URL for our functions, and if we open it up in a new tab, we can go to /products/SKUs/list, which is going to be that route we defined, and we can see that users not found is the error we're getting because we haven't passed in our token. But that means that the basic function is actually working, so let's get in the rest of those functions. Where to start, we're going to paste in our add route where we're going to take in a method of post, and this time we're actually going to use the pre-validation hook on this server route where we're going to try to parse the body, which we're going to pass in the product to that request, where we're going to try to run an operation of insert to our schema of products, our table of SKUs, and we're going to pass in a record of that product and ultimately call done. And what this is going to essentially do is insert that new product data into our product SKUs table. And next we can paste in our update route, where here we're running SKUs update with the method of post. Similarly, we're running the pre-validation hook. This time we're grabbing that product data and we're running update, where really the only big difference is our product needs to include an ID so it can match the record up with the one inside of the database in order to properly update. And if you remember inside of the application code, when we passed in that router query ID, that's where we're going to attribute that from. And finally, we're going to paste in our delete route, where we're going to do, again, something similar with the pre-validation hook, but this time we're only going to parse out the ID from the body because that's all we need, but we're going to run the delete operation and we're going to pass in that hash value where the ID is that hash attribute when we created that table, which is basically saying find that item by its ID and delete it. Now, if you want to follow along and find all this code that you can copy and paste with me, you can find it on HarperDB's blog, where I'm going to include this link inside of the description. But now I'm going to click save just like I did before, and I'm going to click deploy, where once that's restarted and deployed, I'm going to now have my deployed custom functions. Now, finally, as one last thing, let's invoke these custom functions. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to need our API token in order to invoke these functions. So the first thing I'm going to do is back inside of my application, I'm going to create a new file called .env.local, where I'm going to create two variables, my Harper Custom Functions URL, as well as a Harper API key. Now I'm going to grab that functions URL at the bottom left of that page like I did earlier and go to my code and paste that in. But to get my token, I can head over to the config tab where we can see the instance API auth header, where I'm going to copy that value and paste it into my Harper API key. So now let's start setting up our functions to actually invoke those custom functions. So let's start off with the list function, where I'm going to paste that in, where what I'm going to do is create a request object where I'm going to specify my headers for my authorization, where I'm going to use basic authentication and pass in that API key. I'm then going to create my URL, which is going to consist of that custom functions URL, as well as that route to /product/SKUs/list. Finally, I'm going to make a fetch request including all of that and pass back the results as my products. Now, whenever you set an environment variable, you got to make sure that you restart your local development server so that it can actually pick up those variables. But now when we reload the page, we can see that we get a successful request from list where we get an empty list of products, which is expected again because we don't have our product data. But now we can continue on with the rest of them, where we have our add function, where what we're going to do is first parse out that product data that we're posting. We're going to create our request object, which includes that header of authorization and a changed method of post, where we're going to pass in that product data to our add endpoint and pass back the results, including that inserted hash, which is that new ID. Now we can test this one out by clicking add product, where once we get to that form, where we can add some product data, where I'm going to use the product data from allproducts.json, where I'm going to grab my SKU. I'm just going to copy and paste everything in, including my image, my title, and my price, where then I can click the add product button, which is going to make that request, which was successful, and kick me back to the home page where I now have my product. I also went ahead and added the rest of the products from that page. But now let's finish our endpoints with delete and update, where with delete, I'm going to paste in that code and do something similar, but this time only getting that ID like we talked about before, where we're going to create that request object, only passing in that ID, and we're going to hit that delete endpoint. And similarly update, where we're going to pass in the whole product object so that that's going to include the ID, which is going to use to reference what to update. We're going to pass it to that update endpoint and pass back the results. But now finally, that gives us all of our different endpoints. And again, as a reminder, this code is available both inside of the HarperDB blog tutorial as well as the repository that I'll have linked inside of the description. But now let's try to actually update a product, where let's go to Cosmo Kids T-shirt. And I'm going to say, instead of shirt, I want to make that T-shirt because that makes more sense for what it is, right? So I'm going to update that product, and we can see now it says T-shirt. But I realized I ran out of stock of all my sweatshirts, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this sweatshirt. So let's click delete, and we can see that we have that confirmation to actually delete that product. But when we go back to the page, we no longer have our sweatshirt. Now, to show what's actually happening, when we head back over to HarperDB, we can see all of that data inside of our SKUs table, where the cool thing is we never defined the columns for any of this, but that happened dynamically whenever we passed in the data that we wanted to store, including that image, price, SKU, and title, where that ID or that hash attribute was automatically generated every time a new record was added. But no matter if I add a new product, update a product, or delete a new product like the hat, we can see that that data, as soon as I refresh it, is going to reflect those changes that are happening based off those custom functions that are getting invoked inside of my Next.js API routes. But this will give us a full CRUD API in order to perform all those operations, including creating or adding, listing or reading, as well as our update and our delete. CRUD APIs are popular because it's a logical way to perform all those different operations. And being able to invoke those different operations close to the data source, such as with HarperDB Custom Functions, gives us a lot of flexibility for how we actually work with that data. Have you ever created a CRUD API for one of your projects? Let me know in the comments. If you want to work more with HarperDB and add some authentication to your Next.js application, check out my video Next.js Custom Adapter with HarperDB database in Next.js. Or if you want to make managing these products a little bit more interactive, check out my video Trigger Function when scrolling to an element in React with Intersection Observer. Thank you so much HarperDB for sponsoring this video, and if you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.